America still struggles with racism. It's clear that this is a struggle that still exists in America, and politicians like Trump simply toss fuel to the fire. So today we're going to talk about racial capitalism in the United States with a true expert on that important subject. Robin Bernstein is the Dillon Professor of American History at Harvard University. As a cultural historian, she wants to understand the stories we tell about ourselves and how these acts of storytelling shape the future. Her most recent book, Freeman's Challenge: The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, reveals the roots of racial capitalism in the North, not the South, long before the Civil War. She tells this story through the life of William Freeman, a Black and Native American teenager who resisted forced prison labor at its source. Dr. Bernstein, thanks so much for being with us today on the Lean to the Left podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your new book, Freeman's Challenge, delves into the history of America's original prison for profit through the story of William Freeman. What drew you to this particular historical narrative, and why is it relative today?
What drew me to the subject matter was that I found it really surprising. When I first discovered this story, I discovered a story of an African American and Native American teenager who was imprisoned in Auburn, New York, which is in central New York State, from 1840 to 1845, where he was forced to labor, and he was forced to labor to benefit private companies. His labor was leased. It was a system of convict leasing. His labor was sold to private companies. He received no payment whatsoever, and also no other benefits, no early release or privileges or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So he was being forced to work as a prisoner simply to benefit private companies and also to create economic benefits for the prison itself and for the state, but no benefits for him. And when I learned about this, my first thought was, wait a minute, what? Convict leasing in the North in 1840, 2.5 decades before the Civil War?
Yeah.
So I was like a lot of people, I associated convict leasing and profit-driven incarceration with the South after the Civil War. We have a narrative about the 13th Amendment. The idea is that the 13th Amendment, which outlaws forced labor, quote, except as a punishment for crime, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
There's a common understanding that the 13th Amendment from 1865 created the opportunity for a new form of slavery to flourish in the South after the Civil War, a new form of slavery by another name. And what I learned was that, in fact, the South did not invent convict leasing. The South did not invent profit-driven incarceration. It was the North. And convict leasing did come into creation in the wake of slavery, but it came into existence in the wake of Northern slavery, not Southern slavery. It's Northern slavery by another name.
Yeah, I
And
don't
this
think
was
most people know that.
No, most people don't know that. What the
Yeah.
13th Amendment actually did was enable an older form of carceral slavery to continue to exist rather than allow a new one to be created. So the problem with this narrative is that if we focus totally on the 13th Amendment, if we focus on the South,
Right.
we're starting the story in the middle. And when we start the story in the middle, what we're doing inadvertently is letting the North off the hook. So what I wanted to do in Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit, was put the North back on the hook.
Okay. I got that. That's still such a problem today, even today, with prisons for profit, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I live in South Carolina, and I believe that, I'm not positive, but I do believe that we have such prisons here. And it's a horrible, to me, it's just a horrible thing that people are making money off of this and forcing these prisoners to work for really paltry, if any, pay.
Mhm.
And is that a TV show where it's set in California and they have a bunch of prisoners who are fighting fires in California and they're allowed to be out of prison in order to participate in the fighting of the fires because they've had a good record in prison or whatever. But they're not getting, I don't think they're getting paid, at least not in this show. I really like the show, but is that part of this problem, do you think?
Absolutely. So I don't know the TV show you're referring to, but
Uh-huh.
it is the case that in California, prisoners can be forced to work and they are vastly underpaid. And firefighting is one of the jobs that
Yeah.
incarcerated people can have. If I recall correctly, firefighting in California pays $1 per hour. So these are people who are risking their lives
Yeah.
for $1 an hour. This is extremely unjust.
Okay. Let's get back to I interrupted your train of thought, I think, with the California question. But could you elaborate, please, on the connection between Freeman's story and the broader issue of anti-Black racism in America, especially as it relates to the development of these prison systems?
Sure. The original prison for profit was the Auburn State Prison in central New York State. And when this prison was created, it was not created with a racist purpose.
Hmm.
The purpose was not to re-enslave Black people. The purpose was to enslave people. And at the time, the very first set of prisoners in the Auburn State Prison seemed to have been entirely white.
Okay.
But it did not stay that way.
Yeah.
The Auburn State Prison came into being as gradual emancipation was being enacted in New York State. So basically, unlike in the South, emancipation happened slowly in the North, and it happened slowly over a period of arguably as much as 50 years in New York State. And so while this process of gradual emancipation was happening in New York State, at the exact same time, a group of white entrepreneurs in Auburn were inventing a new form of slavery. So these things were happening simultaneously. The economy of New York State was transitioning from being an economy based on slave labor to an economy based on state capitalism. And the prison became a really important part of that. But like I said, and this is really counterintuitive, the original purpose was not racist. The original purpose was all about class. It was all about extracting labor, extracting value. The original goal was all about capitalism, but it did not stay that way. What happened was increasingly Black people became overrepresented in the Auburn State Prison and in prisons in general in New York and throughout the United States. Like I said, the very first group of prisoners seemed to have been 100% white, but then they became increasingly Black. And by the time William Freeman was incarcerated in the Auburn State Prison in 1840, about 1 in 11 prisoners in the Auburn State Prison were Black. So I'm sorry, was 1 in 9 was Black. So that was about 11% of the population was Black. And to put this in perspective, about 2% of New York was Black.
Okay.
So Black people were being overrepresented by more than 4 times.
Yeah,
And
right.
it only went up from there. And now today, of the people who are incarcerated in New York State, about 73% are Black or brown. What's really important to see is that this started out as a capitalist venture that was aiming to enslave people of any race for the
Right.
purpose of bolstering capitalism. And it became very quickly a tool of racism.
Okay. Hey, you guys, if you're hearing thunder, it's because we're having a big thunderstorm right now here in South Carolina where I'm recording this. And there's nothing I can do about that. So I just want to let you know. But we're going to keep on keeping on. I don't care if it's thundering or raining or whatever, because where I'm at, it's nice and dry. Anyway, let's get back to our program. Now, your previous work, Racial Innocence, explored themes of childhood and race in American history. How does your new book build upon or diverge from these themes?
One of the major connections was that the people who organized and founded the Auburn State Prison were a set of white entrepreneurs, some of whom were criminals.
Uh-huh.
And the Auburn State Prison was, in certain ways, a criminal venture. It existed for the purpose of enacting organized labor theft.
Yeah.
It was criminality disguised as justice. But the white people who organized this prison and who led the prison and who perpetuated the prison, they were very, very invested in seeing themselves as the good guys. They
Uh-huh.
were very invested in seeing themselves as innocent.
Right.
So there's a big contest in my book about how we can see ourselves as innocent even when we are committing horrible acts. So the Auburn
Yeah.
State Prison was a site of labor theft. It was a site of torture. It was a site of terrible crimes against humans and against humanity. And it was a site that was inventing a major new form of unfreedom, a major new form of oppression that we are all living with today. And yet a lot of the people who organized this, I'm very sorry to say, they leaned to the left. They were progressives, and they saw themselves as being on the side of the angels. They saw
Yeah.
themselves as racially innocent.
Right.
And so this is a pretty uncomfortable history in a lot of ways to see what intent. Some of the people who created this prison were not at all well-intentioned,
Yeah.
but some of them were.
Yeah.
And the ones who were well-intentioned, who saw themselves as innocent, it's pretty painful to see how they made these terrible mistakes that
Yeah.
have effects 200 years later.
Robin, is your book a novel based on fact and Freeman is a made-up character, or is this really a true story? What you're
Oh,
talking?
every single word in this book is true.
Oh, okay.
Every word.
All
I
right.
did want it to read like a novel.
Okay.
I wanted it to be a book that anybody could pick up,
Mhm.
regardless of their background. There's no jargon in the book. You don't need to have any previous knowledge at all. So I wanted it to be a really great read, to be honest.
Okay.
I wanted people to pick this book up and be unable to put it down.
Good.
So I wrote it in a way that I hope it reads like a novel, and people have told me it reads like a novel. But
Okay.
no, every single word is true.
That's the reason why I asked you the question, because I wanted to make certain that people understood that really this is not a novel and this is really true stuff that we're talking about here. And this William Freeman was a real person, correct?
He was.
No.
He was a teenager who, at the age of 15, was sentenced to the original prison for profit. And what made William Freeman really special, and why I wrote a book about him, is that William Freeman rebelled. William Freeman challenged the Auburn State Prison. He challenged the original prison for profit. He was an enormously brave person.
He demanded wages, and I guess that had profound implications, right?
Yeah, that's right. What William Freeman said was that he did not want to work in prison, and that the reason he didn't want to work was that he had committed no crime. He was
Mhm.
convicted of a horse theft, but he always insisted he had not committed the horse theft. So he did not want to work because he had committed no crime, he said, and he also did not want to work for no wages.
Yeah.
He was freeborn. He had always been free. He had never been enslaved. His father had been enslaved.
Yeah.
His grandparents had been enslaved, but he was a free person. He was a citizen, and that's how he thought of himself, as a citizen and a worker. And so he did not want to work for nothing, as he put it.
Yeah.
And he spoke up immediately upon entering the prison. And as I said before, the prison was a very violent place and still is.
Wow.
And the retribution against him was immediate, and it was devastating.
If he was convicted of horse theft, it's a wonder he didn't get hung. That's what they used to do to horse thieves, isn't it?
No, actually, for horse theft in New York State in 1840s, which is when he was convicted,
Okay.
the normal sentence would have been more like 3 years. So
Okay.
he actually had a higher than normal conviction. And we
Okay.
can speculate about why that was and whether race had anything to do with that.
Okay. I guess I'm just thinking about the old time Western movies where they hung horse thieves. Okay. Lucky for William Freeman, that wasn't the case in New York. All right. Let's see. I shouldn't be chuckling about that because it's not funny. Now, considering the persistent myth of inherent Black criminality today? How can understanding the historical roots of the prison for profit system inform current conversations about racial justice and incarceration?
Yeah. So this racist idea that Black and brown people are somehow biologically more prone to criminality, that's a formation of racism
Yeah,
that is very prevalent today and that has
mhm,
a lot of power today.
yeah,
One of the things I wanted to bring forward in Freeman's challenge is that though that idea has not always existed. It has a beginning. And one of the really important points of beginning is actually tied to William Freeman's story.
mhm,
At the time in the 1840s, the idea, this racist idea of Black criminality, it did exist, but it was a fringe idea. It wasn't an idea that had a whole lot of purchase. It wasn't an idea that was familiar to a whole lot of people. And then William Freeman, after he was resisting the Auburn State Prison, William Freeman did, after he was released from his incarceration for horse theft, he continued to resist the prison, and his resistance culminated in a murder. And when I say
okay,
that, I'm not giving away anything. The murder is in the title of the book. It's Freeman's Challenge: The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit.
okay,
So he does commit a murder,
okay,
and then he goes to trial for it. And his trial got very big very fast. So this is a trial in 1846 in New York State,
mhm,
and celebrities got involved in the trial. And the trial was trumpeted across the United States. It was called the trial of the half century. And one thing that happened in this trial was that both the defense and the prosecution both articulated this idea of an allegation of inherent Black criminality. They both did this.
mhm.
And then their arguments got repeated nationally. So this was actually, and at the time, this was a novel idea. This was an unfamiliar idea. And it got really big and really amplified and sent out very broadly. So this is actually a really important kind of inaugural moment in this horrible racist libel that has had so much influence for 180 years now. We can
Mhm.
actually see it forming in these individuals who were involved in William Freeman's life. And again, I'm very sorry to say that the defense, William Freeman's defense lawyer, leaned to the left. He was William Henry Seward, who would later be Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. He saw himself as a reformer. He was a Whig. He saw himself as somebody who was progressive.
Okay.
But he was actually, I am very sorry to say, one of the architects of this horrible, diabolical, destructive, injurious, racist idea of Black criminality.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman as figures who devised strategies of resilience and resistance during this time. How about discussing some of these strategies and their impact?
Yeah. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman are both really important people in the book. Like I said, William Freeman's life touched a lot of really well-known people, like William Henry Seward, like Harriet Tubman. Some of the most important people from the 19th century were connected to William Freeman and he to them. So this is, again, a really surprising, amazing story. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were two of the people who had to figure out how to live in the aftermath of William Freeman's resistance and these horrible racist myths that were that coalesced through his trial and then were set loose in
Okay.
American culture forever. So they had to figure out how to do that. And they had different approaches. So Harriet Tubman actually came to Auburn, New York, right near the Auburn State Prison. She came in the 1850s and she chose to live there for the second half of her life. She lived in Auburn until her death in 1913. So she was the great emancipator, and here she was living less than 2 miles away from the prison. She knew a lot of members of William Freeman's family. She worshiped at the same church that they worshiped at. And some of her relatives were politically engaged with some of his relatives on the Underground Railroad. So she was connected to William Freeman and she was connected to the prison, but she never wrote about the prison. And here she was spending her life fighting for freedom. And there was this horrific form of unfreedom literally 2 miles from her house. And she had to live with those contradictions. And what I take from that is that what Harriet Tubman's contradictions in her life are very similar to the contradictions in our lives. We are all very close to profit-driven prison, all of us, no matter what state we live in. The profit motive has infiltrated all prisons. The idea that a prison, on the one hand, it's bad because it's racist. On the other hand, it's good because it brings jobs.
Yeah.
That kind of thinking infiltrates all prisons globally today.
Yeah.
So that kind of thinking that is embedded in all of our minds, we recognize it as familiar because it's already inside of us. That kind of living with contradictions is something that we can see in Harriet Tubman's life. And Frederick Douglass also got involved in Auburn in the wake of Freeman's trial. Auburn had been a very important place on the Underground Railroad. Auburn had been there'd been a lot of Underground Railroad activity in Auburn, which is why Harriet Tubman came there in the first place.
All right.
But it was not an important place for Black abolitionist lecturers. But immediately after the trial, literally weeks after the trial, Auburn became a really important stop for Black abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass. All of a sudden, after these horrible racist lies had been told about Black people through William Freeman's trial, all of a sudden, all these Black abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, wanted to come to Auburn. And they started to come and they made it a regular part of their circuits, their lecture circuits. And what's really cool about that is that here, the Auburn was a site of anti-Black racist lies. And Frederick Douglass's response was to come to Auburn and tell the truth of his own life. And that's what other people did too. And that's how they countered the lies and the racism that emerged through Freeman's trial.
Now, as a historian, how do you navigate the challenges of presenting historical narratives like William Freeman's in a way that resonates with contemporary audiences?
Yeah, I think in some ways it was actually really easy because the events are so contemporary. What William Freeman faced was in some ways so similar to what we have today. And what a lot of people have told me is that there's a kind of uncanny resonance between the historical events that I'm narrating and a life today. One person who was formerly incarcerated told me that William Freeman's experience very much aligned with his own and echoed his own. And he basically said that I got it right in representing that experience. And on the one hand, I was very glad that I got it right. On the other hand, I was so sorry that I got it right. I was so sorry that William Freeman's experience was so familiar to this person today. It shouldn't be. We should have moved on. We should have changed, but we haven't.
What can be done about this for-profit prison system that we have?
The first thing we can do is question its fundamental ideals. So one thing that we should be focusing on is the weirdness of some of what we've been told about prisons. For example, here, let me give you an example. Let's suppose I wanted to open a prison right next to your house. And I wanted to convince you that this was a great idea. You should support this. Would I argue that prisons help people reform and help people become better people? And since you care about people becoming better people, you should support this. Would that argument work? Would I argue, actually, prisons are all about justice and you're in favor of justice. So therefore, we should bring in this prison right next to your house because it'll bring justice to your neighborhood. And isn't that a wonderful thing? You're laughing because these are laughable arguments. They wouldn't work at all. The argument that would have the greatest chance of working is, I would say, we should bring this prison to your backyard, to your neighborhood, to your community, because it'll bring jobs. It'll
Right.
still stimulate the economy. That's the argument that would work. That
Mhm.
is the exact argument that was invented in Auburn in the early 19th century. It was these individuals. And when you read my book, you can actually meet the individuals who came up with this weird idea. So, what I want the book to do is to make us actually hear the weirdness of these ideas. Why should any person benefit from another person's incarceration?
Really.
Why should I, as a taxpayer, benefit from somebody else's labor in prison?
Right.
Why should the argument that, oh, their work saves money and therefore saves you on your taxes? I don't want to save on my taxes in that way.
Right.
Why should I consent to saving on my taxes in that way? So the first thing that we can do is start to hear the weirdness of these lies and
Right.
stories that we've been
Right.
told. And then
Right.
the second thing we can do is support the prison abolition movement. There is an organized prison abolition movement. I end the book with some links to some very reputable organizations. And
Okay.
I also end the book with some recommended reading about prison abolition.
Okay.
We can build a world that has justice without prisons. It is possible and we can do it.
Okay. Great. Now, where can people find your book? And how can they reach out to you if they want to do that?
It's easy to reach out to me. My name is Robin Bernstein, and people can just Google my name. I teach at Harvard, so there are quite a few Robin Bernsteins, including one who is a Trump appointee. I'm not that Robin Bernstein, but if you find the Robin Bernstein who teaches at Harvard, there's only one of those. So you
Okay.
can find my email and reach out to me. You can buy Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Anywhere books are sold, you can get it at an online bookstore. You can also get it from your local bookstore or library. If they don't have it in stock, they can order it for you.
Okay. That's great. And I'll be putting a link in the notes for this show where people can just click on that link and it'll take them right to the book and they'll be able to buy it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to thank you, Robin, very much for being with us on the Lean to the Left podcast. And this is a topic that has concerned me, the prison for profit system, which I think is horrible. And so I'm glad that we're able to take a look at it today with you. And I'm sure that anyone who is concerned about this will find your book to be of value and to be interesting. And the idea that you wrote it to read like a novel, I think that's just a great idea. And I'm sure that it will work for you. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this Lean to the Left video and that you found it interesting and informative. Please visit on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that focus on progressive politics and the important social issues of our time. Now, our interview shows stream on Mondays with special episodes on Thursdays. And you can check out upcoming shows, guests, and topics at podcast.leantotheleft.net. Subscribe to our audio version there and to our video shows here at YouTube. And follow us on social media. Facebook at Bob Gaddy and the Lean to the Left podcast. Now, it's two. Bob Gaddy is one Facebook page, and the Lean to the Left podcast is a second Facebook page. Twitter at Lean to the Left 1. Instagram at Lean to the Left 1. TikTok at Lean to the Left. LinkedIn at Bob Gaddy. And YouTube at Lean to the Left. Now, I hope you'll support Lean to the Left as well so we can keep things going. Just click on the Donate tab at the top of the leantotheleft.net homepage and contribute by buying me a cup of coffee. That'll really help and would be much, much, much appreciated. Now, this is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.